Portland, Oregon. We've always liked to think of it as a progressive town, but has it always been that way? No, it hasn't. Portland was the worst place to be in the Pacific Northwest if you were black in general, or especially if you were unemployed. At least, that's the way it was during the turn of the century and before World War II. For this project, I interviewed my grandpa, Merlin Fisher. He grew up in West Linn during the 40s and mid-50s, and his take on civil rights and other black activities of the time is different than others because he was a bystander who watched from afar. In West Linn, he didn't have much of an idea about how racist the city of Portland was, but he did have an idea about the migration of blacks into the area.
At that time, from my understanding and later, that actually the blacks that were in Portland, Oregon were either they worked in the theater as janitors or they worked on the trains as porters on the train and did the cleaning on the train. And that's why they were in Portland, Oregon, because it was the Union Pacific ran from Portland, Oregon and Chicago. And then you had the theaters there. So that's why they were employed. But then the blacks came during the migration of blacks came during the Second World War to work in the shipyards in Portland, Oregon.
After World War II, many blacks left Portland because of the discrimination and the lack of work. My grandpa also said blacks moved in the
late 40s and early 50s, and then they were all in the Albina area in Portland.
Albina used to be its own city, but it was annexed by Portland in 1891. The Memorial Coliseum is where Albina used to be. It originally contained European immigrants, but after 1910, African Americans slowly moved in.
And then they moved into Alberta, on Alberta Street, clear out to 39, certainly 33rd and past. And the high schools in Jefferson then become predominantly black. And Grant High School was a lot of blacks in it. But Jefferson, which was an old established area where rich people lived, became the area in which lots of blacks moved in. And of course, Roosevelt High School being over in North Portland, there was a lot of blacks there too. But that wasn't in my when I was going to high school.
Blacks faced a lot of prejudice in Portland and in the state of Oregon. After all, the state constitution used to say that free blacks can't come to Oregon, make contracts, or own property. I bet you didn't know about the Coon Chicken Inn off Sandy Boulevard. The name was protested by a lot of blacks, but nothing was ever done. Nobody did anything about the racist name of that restaurant.
Now, did I ever see any prejudice? I remember in high school where this guy ran up and took this football and slammed it right into the black. And I don't know if the blacks turned red, but I'll tell you, you could see it well on the skin,
My grandpa spoke about the racism in Lake Oswego as well.
And let's say you were living in Lake Oswego, you wouldn't have seen this. How many blacks did you have in Lake Oswego in the 50s or the early 60s? You didn't have many blacks there.
Zero.
Zero. We had some in West Linn, but that's across the border.
My grandpa saw racism at Oregon State as well.
Oregon State, which we went, there were no blacks. There weren't that many blacks at that time. Later, the big thing on the blacks was with the football team, and DeAndros, the football coach, wanted them to shave their face, and they didn't want to. They thought and wanted their hair off their face because
They like to grow their beards or something?
yeah, they wanted to grow their beards, and so he didn't want that. And so a lot of them then kind of was pressed against playing sports for Oregon State.
DeAndros coached at Oregon State between 1965 and 1975. He was nicknamed the Great Pumpkin because of his physical appearance and the orange clothing he would often wear. He even had a custom-made orange and black Oldsmobile. There was a specific event that happened between Andros and a black player. It was called the Milton Affair. Fred Milton, a star linebacker, was told by Andros that he could not wear his goatee. Milton refused, and protests were started by the 47 black students at OSU. The faculty even supported Milton. Andros later said they were giving the hippies license to walk naked at graduation. Milton left the program and ironically played for Utah State, which was an even wider university than OSU. My grandpa told me about where he was when Martin Luther King Jr. got shot, and his feelings about him as an individual and the aftermath of the assassination.
But I think the Martin Luther King thing was really made the biggest difference. You know, when they had the march from Selma, Alabama, or wherever it was. I mean, that was the turning, that was what brought them, you know, the blacks to the forefront.
The March from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama was a famous civil rights demonstration orchestrated by Martin Luther King Jr., SNCC, and the SCLC. There were actually 3 phases. In the first march, the demonstrators arrived at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and were subsequently beaten by Alabama state troopers while attacked with tear gas. They never crossed the bridge. The second attempt was halted peacefully, and again, the bridge was never crossed. Finally, on March 21, 1965, King and 320 blacks and whites crossed the bridge guarded by the Alabama National Guard, who had been ordered to do so by Lyndon Johnson. This march helped quicken the passage of the Voting Rights Act. It passed easily due to the atrocities committed on the blacks as seen by Congress.
I do remember the day Martin Luther King was assassinated, because I was in Cincinnati, and of course this happened, I think, in Memphis, but I thought, because Cincinnati's on the border of the Mason-Dixon line, I mean,
thought there'd be riots.
I did think there'd be riots. I thought that, and this whole hotel, downtown Cincinnati was black.
Wait, so you did think there'd be riots?
I did in Cincinnati, yeah, because you're right across the river from Kentucky. Kentucky's in the south, and Ohio's in the north. That's the Mason-Dixon line. And they were all the blacks in the hotel, and I really did think this may get really tense there. If you look back on reading it, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, the president, he's the one that tried to cut a deal with, you know, he did more for the blacks as far as that. He's the one that would actually try to deal with Martin Luther King Jr. Look, I don't think, from where we're coming from, that he meant that much to us. It does now. I can see this means a lot to the blacks now. But I didn't see where he was, you know, where they would pay that much attention to him.
We even talked about the racism that's currently going on in the United States.
Like, since I know that you go to coffee all the time with guys, you didn't go to coffee when you were younger, did you? With other people?
No, you didn't. But it's, yeah. And, you know, I don't even want to tell you right now just because of what they would say about the president.
Yeah.
You know, it's totally unacceptable. And as far as I'm concerned, this discussion's over at that point. Just get up and walk out.
Yeah.
You know, because you're still using, it's expressions like the 1950. You know, where have you been the last 60 years?
So
and the prejudice isn't all gone in this country, you know. There's still plenty of prejudice around towards the blind.
My grandpa had a lot to say about Vietnam and the black participation in it.
Were you aware that, like, there were more, like, even, like, not necessarily just blacks, but even just, like, people less educated were going to Vietnam?
Yes,
And
no
like,
question about it.
Especially, like,
And it still is the military.
especially blacks, too, just pretty much sent to die almost.
Well, you're
Really.
saying the other guys are getting all deferments and getting student deferments and getting ways to get out of the draft.
Mm-hmm.
And the Vietnam, I mean, I thought I'd be drafted for Vietnam. It wasn't because of physical, you know, but there was a lot of people I did thought I'd be drafted, and I'm sure the others.
Did you know during the war that that wasn't right? Like, it's not really right. Like, how tons of black people were being sent, more than whites, maybe even.
I don't think we did. I mean, you're looking for your own. You're looking at it and say, well, how am I going to cope with this?
Yeah.
You know,
But did you realize more after the war?
Yeah,
Like,
after you're
there
done,
were a lot
you can see they took the blacks.
that never came back.
Yeah. I mean, you see that. I mean, that's what it still is today. You see that you can say, well, it's a volunteer army, yeah, but if you don't have any money, you tend to volunteer. I mean, it's people who have means tend to get out of that kind of stuff.
So do you think that social mobility for class-wise for blacks is harder than whites?
Yes,
A vicious cycle?
still is, yeah,
Vicious
but
cycle.
not as bad as it was. But it's more. It's tougher. Now,
Has it gotten better since a long time ago?
sure, Absolutely.
We got to fight the powers that be. Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant to me. Is he straight out racist? The sucker was simple and